I'm not sure that I'll be delivering any music, but we can in a way go back for a second to Yevanim nikbetzu alai azai b'mei chashmanim ufartzu chomot migdalai v'timeu kol hashmanim. So if we read what was written, I think in the 12th century, is that the story of Hanukkah has to do with the temple, with almost destruction of, like semi-destruction of the temple, right? Halfway destruction. But is that the story of Hanukkah? And it's always a dilemma how you teach when you teach a very big group of people, but I still want you to share with me what exactly is Hanukkah about? What are we celebrating? So if you can write down in the chat what is Hanukkah about, I'll appreciate it. Why are we celebrating Hanukkah? If you want to open your microphone and just shout, that's also fine.
In Israel, growing up, after Israel was established, we celebrated Hanukkah as a revolt and ability to fight for our own independence.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, you're basically
not a miracle. The ability to fight and establish. Right?
Sorry?
Not as a miracle of the oil, but rather as a fight, ability to fight for independence.
The ability to fight for independence. Okay, wow. And it seems that you're already telling that, and I think it was also in a way in the Levin Kipnis a little bit, and why the Maccabean was so important, and Nomi didn't give us all the songs that has to do with Hanukkah and Zionism, but so you're saying it's about even gaining power, independence, and relate to a new state and having an independent state 2,100 years after, something like that. Okay, and then on the chat, people wrote there was a war going during Sukkot, survival of the right to be different, and the oil, spiritual rededication versus military victory, the victory of the Maccabean who tried to outlaw Jewish practice,
the Greeks tried to outlaw Jewish practices.
Right.
Left out a word.
Dark and sad in the middle of winter, the miracle of the victory over the enemies. Okay, so of course, in a way, all the answers are correct, but what I want to focus about today and is why did the Maccabees? Why there was a war? What was the motivation for the war to begin with? And that's actually a very big question. And in order to go via this question, I want to actually go in a very specific perspective, a perspective of me. And when Dr. Nomi presented me, she referred to the Mishlei program, and the Mishlei program is about, in a way, developing or helping people to be more active in the realm of Judaism in the Israeli society. Of course, our rabbis that we train as well are also need to be active in the realm of Judaism in the Israeli society. And the term that I usually prefer is not necessarily protest, but activism, being active. And at least in Israel, when we use the term activist or activism, we refer to people who are active in create a better society, a place that we work at. And when I was preparing more and more this class, I remembered that when the Pew survey polled the American jury, and they tried to ask what are the core values of your Judaism, so two of the first values has to do with Tikkun Olam and with fighting for the rights of another person. And what I want to emphasize today, in a way, is that parallel to this tradition, that I guess that it's a good question where it actually is, where we put the finger and say this is genuine part of the Jewish tradition. And the term Tikkun Olam itself is very ancient. It appears in the Mishnah, but what exactly is the focus of this term is, I think it's a little bit of a challenge to figure out exactly to pinpoint it. But I want to talk more about the basic perspectives that you need to stand up for your rights. You need to figure out your reality and what's happening to you, and to take action. And some of us probably were told the stories that when Matityahu, he probably has an English name as well, but I'll keep calling him Matityahu, was standing and he was saying, Mila Hashem Elai, who is to God should come with me. But the person who actually says that was a different person, even a bigger leader in our tradition. It was Moses, and he did it right after the golden calf episode, and he basically invited people to join him in fighting idolatry in the Jewish people. And he did it by, and actually the Levites joined him. And in a way, this is already an act of taking responsibility for society. Taking responsibility for society in a very challenging manner and in a very violent manner. And in a way, the same tradition went more than 1,000 years later to Matityahu, right? And the text is very interesting, and the text here is from the book of Maccabees. I think this is Maccabees 2nd. And it says that, when so someone is going and is about to worship, to sacrifice for a pagan sacrifice, and when Matityahu saw him, he became angry enough to do what had to be done. Shaking with rage, he ran forward and killed the man right there on the altar. He also killed the royal official who was forcing the people to sacrifice, and then he tore down the altar. In this way, Matityahu showed his deep devotion for the law, just as Pinchas had done when he killed Zimri, son of Salu. Then Matityahu went through the town shouting, "Everyone who is faithful to God, covenant, and obeys his law, follow me." With this, he and his son fled to the mountains, leaving behind all they owned. So here it seems it already correlates, right? Someone was trying to force the Jews to worship the pagan, the idols, and Matityahu was not just not willing to follow, but he was actually stopping another Jew from doing that, and the way he found to stop from doing it was pretty violent, right? And he killed this guy. Now, when historians try to deal with this question, they're facing a very big challenge. Because, and it's an interesting challenge for us, because we already are created more been living in our most of our history was created in a monotheistic period. And one of the challenges of monotheism is that monotheism is about one God, and basically about one right God, and about lots of wrong gods. Okay, not existing gods, of course, fake gods, Elohim Acherim. But the Hellenistic culture had many gods. And not just that it had many gods, it was enabling what we call syncretism, it was enabling bringing the local gods and joining them into the pantheon, into the whole world of our gods. So there was for the Greek culture, there was no challenge by adding the Jewish God into their culture. So how come? Antiochus IV, a Syrian king, is all of a sudden deciding to come up with decrees and to force the Jews to worship another god. This is a very not Hellenistic kind of behavior. This is very wrong in a way. And what we're going to do in the few coming minutes is to see what the different motivations that different historians came up with to explain the act of Antiochus. But before that, a moment before that, I want us to go almost exactly 200 years later, right? If we're talking about the Hasmonean rebellions, we're talking usually about the year 167 BC, and we're jumping now, 300 years later, we're jumping now to the year 132. And anyone remembers what happened in anyone want to shout what happened in 132? Sorry.
Bar Kokhba revolt.
Rebellion of Bar Kokhba.
The rebellion of Bar Kokhba. And is there any holiday for the rebellion of Bar Kokhba?
No, he lost.
No, he lost. Rabbi Golinkin, you're actually giving almost the point, right? The main difference between the Hasmonean revolt and the Bar Kokhba revolt is a result. And when historians are trying to figure out the Bar Kokhba revolts, first of all, they are very challenged because we almost have no sources to work with. But we have two evidences that usually historian uses. One is a text by a Roman historian called Cassius Dio, who wrote that the issue that made the Jews so upset is that Hadrian founded a city in place of the one which has been razed to the ground, this is Jerusalem, naming it Ilia Capitolina, and on the side of the temple of the Jewish God. And it will be interesting to remember what Cassius Dio wrote to us when we'll see one of the reasons maybe for the Hasmonean rebellion. Another source, and it's also correlate with other sources as well, is a source that's called Historia Augusta. This is a Christian source that tells us the story of the Jews, and he basically tells us that at the time the Jews also waged a war because they had been forbidden to practice circumcision. So, and there's a huge historical debate what was the actual reason for the Bar Kokhba rebellion. But what I want to say now already is that, at least from my own perspective, it was a good enough motivation to actually come up with a rebellion. The challenge of Bar Kokhba, or the fact that we now have some criticism on Bar Kokhba, is probably because it didn't succeed. But whether this was a good enough motivation to come up with a revolt, that I think is probably yes. So when we come to try to explain the story of the Hasmonean revolt, so we basically will try to come up with few of the basic explanation, and then we'll have to finish up with the last two. So first explanation is actually a very nice explanation. It tells us that basically Antiochus was not so sane. Most historians say that this is not a good enough argument. It might be something that you can join, that you can use as an add-on, but it's not a good enough argument. The other idea is that for certain reason, Antiochus didn't want to forbid the good Jews from worshipping their own God, but he wanted them also to follow the customs of the Greek. And we have few evidence for that. We have an evidence for that in the Book of Antiquities, when Josephus report on this period, and he tells us that in a letter that Antiochus writes basically to the Samarkand, he tells them that they are no way concerned with accusation which belong to the Jews, but choose to live after the custom of the Greeks. From that we learn that the Jews were not willing to live according to the customs of the Greeks. And we also see another source that says that they were told to put to death every Jew who refused to adopt the Greek way of life. And that's actually a source that relates not to Judea, but actually probably to Jews in Antioch, in the Syrian area. And the third source tells us, it's actually a source already relating to King Antiochus V, that gained his authority after his father died. And he is telling that he understands that the Jews do not wish to adopt the Greek way of life, as my father had intended, but prefers their own way of life and have requested that they be allowed to live according to their own customs. So according to this tradition, to this explanation, the motivation of Antiochus was to have all his people in all of his kingdom follow the Greek customs. And the reasons that the Jews rebelled, or the certain group of Jews that rebelled because they were not willing to follow the Greek customs. And it's always a good question to ask, and I'll just ask the question, but we won't discuss it. Well, are there any other customs that we're not willing to take today, or are we in a way forced to take certain customs from outside, and what we do in order to prevent this, and are we willing to fight in order not to do that? And are there any Jews that are willing to fight in order not to do that? And is it a good motivation or a bad motivation? All these questions probably are worth thinking about, but we're just going to mention them. And we even see that Yason, one of the priests that we considered a priest that was more leaning towards the Greek culture, was doing certain things to make Jerusalem living according to the Greek way of life. So this is still relating to this notion. Another notion is pretty similar, but it has a small and a very important small difference. Is not the focus is not on the Greek customs, but the focus is on actually accepting Antiochus as a god. And even that he wanted one pagan official religion, and he wanted people not to follow their own customs. This appears both in the first book of Maccabees. It's also appear in one of the interesting sources that already deal with the Hasmonean rebellion, and that's the book of Daniel. And in Daniel chapter 11, we see there's a pretty long unit that is most authorities understand it to deal exactly with the gaining force of Antiochus IV. And it basically tells us that, and this very specifically tells us that he sees himself as the supreme God. Daniel 11:36. But probably none of this is exact. So there are a few other options. So now we want to move to two of the other explanations, and these two other explanations we usually when at least when I was learning this period. So we even mentioned the specific historian who claims this narrative. So the first one is a historian who lived actually in Germany right before World War II. During his name was Elias Bickerman. And he argued basically that the whole story of Yason and Menelaus, the whole story of the two high priests that were probably assigned by the Greeks and followed some of the Greek custom and were bringing the notion of the polis to Jerusalem and bringing all kind of Greek customs to the city. So they were actually challenged because there was a group that was not willing to take their example and to follow them. And according to Bickerman, as they were so upset with them, so that they actually asked the Syrian kings, they asked Antiochus to help them to prevent, and to enforce the Greek culture that they accepted, and they were the one initiating his decrees. And then a few years later, another historian by the name of Avigdor Cherikover came up and argued a very, very interesting and different narrative altogether. And he basically argued that the decrees are not the reason for the rebellion, but they're actually the outcome of the rebellion. And the rebellion came up for, in a way, and that's an interesting question how to look at it, more minor reasons. So the first reason was an event that took place probably after the war that Antiochus had in Egypt and was not successful. And of course, as any war at this period, war cost lots of money because there were now lots of mercenaries to pay to. And part of the way to find money was to go to the temple of the other people and to take the money that was there. So here we're told that in the year 143, we count according to the deaths of Alexander Mukdon. So it's actually the year of 169 before the Hasmonean rebellion. After the conquest of Egypt, Antiochus marched with a great army against the land of Israel and the city of Jerusalem. In his arrogance, he entered the temple and took away the gold altar, the lampstand, and all its equipment. And this makes everyone very upset. But according to Cherikover, it not just did make them upset, it actually makes them rebel. So first, they rebelled locally. They rebelled against the Lysimachus. Lysimachus was assigned by Menelaus to serve as high priest when Menelaus had another business. And according to the second book of Maccabees, the Jews rebelled against him, killed few of his men, wounded many of the rest, and then killed him as well. So this is already an act of rebellion because basically the high priest was assigned by the Greek authorities. By killing the high priest, you're basically rebelling against the authorities. Another example of a rebellion, Cherikover claims that took place a little bit later when Yason actually tried to gain his priesthood from Menelaus. And the sources tell us that he was not successful, but he actually was thrown away and ran away, and someone else kind of gained regime. It's unclear who gained regime instead of Yason, and Cherikover assumed that this was the Hasidim. This was a group that was way more conservative and way more going with according to the Jewish laws and had nothing to do with the Greek laws. And then, and this is verse 11, when the news of what had happened in Jerusalem reached Antiochus, he thought the whole country of Judea was in revolt. He became as furious as wild as an animal. So he left Egypt and took Jerusalem by storm. So if you want to review now the reasons, okay? So one of the reasons that the Jews were not willing to accept the Greek customs, not that they were supposed to prevent, not to keep the Jewish custom, but they were supposed to do both Greek customs and Jewish customs. Of course, you can argue that some of the Greek customs were beyond the lines. They were crossing the line of Judaism, right? If in the gymnasium in sports was done in nakedness, for example, this might be not accepted by Judaism. Some of the gymnasium has idols in them. It's assumed that the gymnasium in Jerusalem didn't have one. But anyway, accepting the Greek custom is not necessarily going side by side with Judaism, but on the other hand, it was not yet a decree on Judaism itself. According to motivation number 2, right, the reason was the unwillingness to accept Antiochus as a god. Interesting enough, in a way, definitely not as a god, but the Jews were willing to pray for their kings and their Caesars when they had to. So it's interesting to see where is the exact line, what you can follow and what you can't follow. When we shift to Elias Bickerman, so this is becoming even more complicated, right? Because basically the actual rebellion was not against the Syrians. It was against certain Jews who kind of shifted from the way, right? And who accepted too many Greek customs. And this sounds very Jewish, so sorry, from my personal perspective. And when these Jews were attacked, the Jews asked the Goyim, okay, the Syrian king, to help them fighting back. And the last reason is that the Jews were kind of rebelling because of the treasures of the temples, because they were not willing to accept the high priest. And it seems also because they were not fully, they didn't have in mind that they're going to bring such a big riots all together in such a big balagan. But the story, in a way, and those of you who look at the screen, you see that there's also, right, in the second book of Maccabees, we also have another story that is more about, right, that the Jews were not willing to break the law and are willing to die in order to prevent themselves or to avoid breaking the law. There's a few of these stories as well already, right? The story of Kiddush Hashem in a way. And what I want you to take from this are two things. First of all, what in our Hanukkah today has to do with this, with really asking ourselves, what are the reasons that we are willing to fight for? What makes us willing to fight for something? What are we willing to protest about? And in this case, protest and risk our life. And the second is that it's unclear, and it's almost a very big question whether the actual motivation for Hanukkah is a motivation that we would follow today. And that might put the emphasis on actually celebrating this holiday, not because of what took place between the years 167 and 161, but actually because of what happened between the year 161 and the year 67, or between the Pompeius journey to the land of Israel, which basically was the establishing of an independent Jewish kingdom, the last Jewish kingdom before the state of Israel, that was pretty independent for at least 100 years and was a big story of success. And in maybe next Hanukkah, we might dedicate the effort not to understand the rebellion and the story of why it succeeded, but actually the diplomacy of Shimon and Yonatan and their predecessors that enabled the Jewish kingdom and the Hasmonean kingdom to grow and develop. Chanukah Sameach. Any questions?
Any questions or comments to Rabbi Avi? Avi, but of all those theories, Avi, Chirikover, Bickerman, etc., do you find one convincing, or it's up in the air?
Rabbi Golinkin?
Yes.
Okay, Jack has we had a big problem with our computer, so Jack wants to answer something about the Moed Sur. Would that be okay?
Sure. If Nomi's still on, Dr. Nomi Cohen-Center, you still here?
Naomi, I think
Yes, I
you're
am.
still on, right?
Okay.
Okay. You mentioned that Moed Sur came from the Martin Luther, right?
Well, it's not exactly from him. He also probably took and related to earlier folk songs. So yes.
Okay. And it was memorialized by Felix Mendelssohn in his Reformation Symphony, the main theme of the final movement being da 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 da, which is a transformation musically of da 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 da. And also the wording of Martin Luther's hymn was Ein fester Burger ist uns Gott, which is German for Ma'os zur Yeshuati. So we may have stolen the melody from them, but I think they stole the words from us.
Very good. I'll have to look that up. I'll have to look into that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yishar kochacha, Jack.
Thank you.
Rabbi Avi, I just wanted to ask you, I recently reread Bickerman and Chirikover and all the theories as well. Do you find any one of them convincing, or it's we'll wait until Eliyahu Navi solves the issue?
First of all, I think the question is very good. The question, I think, is I don't think we can write the history without really putting a big question mark on the motivation of Antiochus. Like, and so we need a very good explanation for his motivations. That's a clear part. I think that Cherikover plays a little bit with the sources on one hand in order to claim that it was clear that it was a Jewish revolt before the decrees maybe, but before even Antiochus' intervention. On the other hand, there is lots of criticism on Bickerman because few historians claim that he was really motivated by the relationship between the Reform community and the Orthodox community back in Germany in the 1930s. Professor Uriel Rappaport argues that this is not true, but yet he's not accepting his theory. So it seems to me that the theory that is kind of the most convincing one is the Cherikover theory, but yet you can see the holes in it as well. So I think we're not looking necessarily for Eliyahu, but we're looking for, this spark of an historian that will see the picture again and will look again without any pre-assumptions, and will find a better explanation. Because it's clear to me that the question is right. Like it's in a way it's hard for us as people who lived in a monotheistic period when religious wars are part of our basic cultures, or used to be part of the basic culture for more than 1,000 years in this world. But there were no religious wars before Christ, before Christianity took regime, and then before Islam took another regime. So it's very hard to understand the religious component. Similar goes when people try to analyze the Bar Kokhba rebellion. It's pretty clear that
Right.
the decree that
You have the same argument. Some historians say that the decrees led to the revolt, and others say the decrees were the result of the revolt.
Right, and it seems to me that and we need to accept this as a notion, and we need to keep the question mark open.
Okay, I would like to conclude by answering a question that Dr. Nomi Cohen-Centner put regarding Maoz Sur, which is, label the Chazan that she mentioned. Leib Glantz was very upset that we adopted this nigun from the Goyim, from the non-Jews, God forbid. But I think that's always been our dilemma throughout history. When do we protest and say, no, we will not accept the Greek gods, and we will not accept the decree against circumcision and Shabbat? But there are other things that we will take and we will adopt. And one of the things we've always taken and adopted is music, which I'm sure Nomi can give us many examples of. And the other is customs, which I didn't have time to say before. The irony of the Sivivon, of the dreidel, is that we celebrate our freedom from the Greeks by spinning a top, which we adopted from the Germans. And we celebrate the Seder on Pesach by taking the Greek Hellenistic Symposium and totally throwing out the contents which they used at the Seder and putting in our contents, which are totally different from the Greek Symposium. So I think that throughout Jewish history, the Jewish people, perhaps with its what Professor Yaakov Katz called instinct rituali, the ritual instinct of the Jewish people, knew when to protest and say, no, we're not going to do that, and knew when to take a foreign custom and adopt it. And what exactly that formula is, I don't know, but that's what we've been doing for over 2,000 years, rejecting certain customs as totally against Judaism and adopting other customs and reworking them, and other music and reworking them throughout Jewish history. So I'd like to leave you with that note. I'd like to thank our lecturers, Professor Doron Bar, Dr. Naomi Cohen-Sentner, Rabbi Avi Novis-Deutsch, and especially Moria Karsagi, who you probably did not see on screen, but who was the one who took care of all the technical aspects of zooming into Hanukkah, the invitation, and this Zoom conference itself. We thank you all. We wish you all a Chag Chanukah Sameach. And I think that tomorrow, Naomi, Moria will be sending out the recordings so you can listen to them and share them with your friends. Toda Rabba and Chag Chanukah Sameach.
כל הכבוד, חג חנוכה שמח.